What's up, everybody? My name's Joseph Coyne. I'm the Performance Director of the UFC Performance Institute Shanghai. And look, to start, I want to say thanks to Vald. It's a pleasure to be able to share some of the work we're doing out in Shanghai with the UFC PI. And look, this is just a primer for a Q&A we'll be doing later on with Vald, which will be longer format. We can dive into some of these topics in more depth if people have questions about our operations. On this Q&A, we'll also have our heads of technical departments in Shanghai. So this will be Dean Ammerzinger, who's the MMA head coach and head of MMA there. There's Gavin Pratt, who's the head of S&C. There's Dr. Reed Reel, who's head of nutrition. There's Felix Falkenberg, head of sports science, and also Paul Holmes, who's our head physical therapist. So they'll all be on the Q&A, and they can really dive into their respective areas. So this presentation is about our program philosophy and program structure. To start with our philosophy, I'm just going to outline some of our vision, mission, and strategy. Also, our interdisciplinary approach to our performance team, the performance processes we try and outline and how we try and impact performance in actual competition, and also how we then try and take that back and put it into a system. So firstly, before you go into any undertaking, you kind of want to have a vision for what you actually want to be or do. For us, this is to be the global blueprint for holistic MMA talent development. And the mission around that is to set the global standard for talent development, preparation, performance, and athlete health and well-being for all the combat sports. To achieve that mission and vision, we have some strategies. The major strategies we're going to talk about and outline here is how we fully integrate our technical and non-technical, the MMA and performance service structure, around the athlete. So it revolves around the athlete and is defined by best practice. So when we talk about our performance team model, this organization structure is really influenced by Dr. Duncan French, who's our Vice President of Performance. And this is what we call an interdisciplinary flat performance team model. Now, it's interdisciplinary because you might have a multidisciplinary team, but that multidisciplinary team, you might have all the physical therapists, the strength and conditioning coaches, the sports scientists, the sports psychologists, but they're not interacting or coming together on topics. You're not getting this interdisciplinary approach. Now, we also call this a flat model. And the flat model is because the expertise across the technical areas is all considered equal. So that's for the MMA coaches, for the S&C, for the sports science. All the technical areas then report to an agnostic performance director who sets goals and interaction structures that are universal to the technical areas. Now, I will say, even though it is a flat structure, there will be times when situational leads are possible in certain situations or when there's specific performance problems to solve. So for instance, in a long-term rehabilitation, the physical therapy department might be the situational lead at the beginning of that long-term rehabilitation. And I'd also make a quick note about this athlete-centered, staff-led, data-informed, environment-enabled. This data-informed doesn't just have to be objective data, but also subjective. I'm a big believer in subjective responses and training load monitoring, and also, especially in relation to the sport you're working with and the technical coaches' subjective views. You can't discount years and years of experience in a particular sport, both competing, because most coaches are former athletes, and then watching athletes while they're coaching. So that's a big consideration around turning those subjective views into something you can use as data and helping that inform your processes. Then we'll look at our performance process. Now, to start with any performance process, you need to know how you're going to impact performance. So you need to know what the actual event demands of the sport are. And each year we learn more and more about the sport of MMA. From there, we move in the cyclical process to profiling against the demands. And ideally you use a system-based approach. And after this, you go into objectives and goal setting, and here you would set both technical and non-technical goals for your athletes from these goals or from this profiling. These profile results and goals then inform the athlete's individual strategy, which is our fourth box there. And then you apply the strategy to the athlete, and as you go, you monitor and audit and go from there. Now, with this circular process around our performance process, there's two main collaboration areas. The first one is helping to determine what it takes to win, from the event demands And this is from the athletes and coaches, and also with assistance from the performance service team or the non-technical areas, and predominantly in this case, probably a sports scientist. So this what it takes to win is really important. You have to have a clear understanding of that before you start working through the profiling against demands and the objectives and the goal setting, individual strategy, and monitoring and audit. The next main collaboration area is over the profile, objectives, and individual strategy. And this is where all the team will come together. They'll decide what's important for the athlete in their respective areas, and then how we're going to apply that individual strategy to actually impact performance where it matters in competition. So just an example from the UFC in our sport, professional MMA. These are the top 5 KPIs, key performance indicators for men and women across all the weight classes. Now, it just so happens that 73% of the top 5 KPIs across all the weight classes are striking related. So look, my grandmother will be able to tell me striking seems pretty important, right? The next step from here is once we figure out that striking is important, we need to create a systems-based approach based on this importance and then try and identify how we're going to impact that in the actual competition performance. So a system-based approach might look like this. We've got our winning performance, significant strikes per minute KPI. From here, you can work backwards through both technical and non-technical streams. So in this case, if we're looking at, say, significant strikes per minute KPI for winning performances, you'd probably say, hey, before you can achieve the competition KPI, you'll want to be able to do this in sparring in a fatigue state. And you might also want, in sparring, a little bit of a buffer. Let's say 10% of the KPI you need in competition, just so you can prepare yourself adequately for the competition, where things like nerves and a weight cut really get in your way and might impact your performance. And then if we follow this technical training stream, before you can do it in a fatigue state in sparring, you're going to be have to do it fresh in sparring or other live goes. And prior to that, you're going to have to do it in drilling situations repeatedly and under fatigue. And prior to that, first and foremost, you actually have to be able to perform the technique in training and in drills. So then if we move to the non-technical stream, before you get to fatigue sparring, your fatigue sparring KPI, you want to make sure you actually have the physical, mechanical, and metabolic power requirements. And this might be both maximal power and power endurance to adequately fulfill that fatigue sparring KPI. Before you meet those power requirements, those power KPIs in the non-technical stream, you're probably going to want to have some strength KPIs. And before that, you actually have to have the joint and biomechanical range of motion requirements to actually perform the technique before you want to start loading it. So this is an approach of how we work backwards from what's going to impact performance and then start making sure we're checking the boxes on the way through to making athletes better in their actual sport. So that gave you a little bit of an understanding of our program philosophy. Now I'm going to talk about the program structure. And in this program structure, we've got some periodization models and also performance timelines. I will also go into some of our system-based diagnostics and how we make decisions on an interdisciplinary team, and then also our schedule, and give you a broad overview of our schedule and how we try and pair technical and non-technical components together in something that makes sense to us. So to start with, this is our concurrent technical and non-technical periodization model. We try and make it as complementary as possible. And there are 2 distinct phases. There's off-camp, basically when there's no fight booked, and there's fight camp, when there's a fight booked or when you're going to enter into the fight. Now, each of these phases, off-camp and fight camp, are then divided into 2 other sections. In off-camp, we have general preparation and specific preparation, and in fight camp, we have early and late fight camp. Now, one thing to note is that in our model, we can get away with much shorter fight camps than what you might typically hear of in other professional MMA settings. So, and the reason behind that is we have athletes training almost all year round. So it's not like they have a long layoff and they need to go in for a 12 to 8 week fight camp, which is the norm in the industry. We can get away with a 6-week fight camp just because we're doing so much preparatory work with them. And this is just like the cherry on top of the sundae to really hone them into the fight and what they need to do in the fight. If you look at the colors should make sense to you, but the colors moderate is orange, loading, high is red, so high loading is red, and green is a low loading. So if you look at fight camp, it goes moderate, high, low, high, moderate, low. for the technical stream, and then the non-technical stream goes moderate, high, low, moderate, low. Now, generally, we prefer 3 weeks in our cycles. Now, the reason for this is there are 3 requirements to win a fight, right? First, you don't get injured in the lead up. And this is where the three-week cycles really comes in. You'll have more deload weeks with a 3-week mesocycle than you will have a 4-week mesocycle. So this just keeps that injury risk in check, especially when the whole aim of the sport is to injure the other person. Then the second requirement to win a fight is you've got to make weight. You've got to make weight to get paid, and sometimes if you don't make weight, you might not be able to fight. This is a huge consideration in our sport, especially if the athlete is in a calorie deficit, and it's also interrelated to that injury risk and the 3-week cycles. For instance, the greater the calorie deficit, potentially the greater injury risk in the lead up. So that's another reason why we really prefer the 3-week cycles. And then lastly, in the fight, you have to perform well in the fight, which is where your technical and non-technical training come to play. But if you don't check off 1, not getting injured, and 2, making weight first, you might not even get a chance to perform. So those should be of importance and take precedence in some situations. Now, of course, the 3-week cycles, it doesn't always work that way with fight dates and things change, and we alternate between 3 and 4-week cycles based on where things are. But pretty much always our fight camp will be a 6-week cycle, 2 3-week cycles in a 6-week block. Now, if they are 3-week phases, the non-technical loading will mirror the technical loading with a moderate high-low setup, except for late fight camp, where you take the load away from non-technical earlier than technical training. So this is also a consideration around professional MMA, where the last week is basically just cutting weight, and doing any significant non-technical work, like significant S&C work, is probably going to be more likely to do harm than help, with the considerations that were around weight cutting, being a calorie deficit, and so on. And so look, we can get into this model in a bit more depth with people in the Q&A for what's interested. I'm going to move on now to what we call our performance timeline. So we have this periodization model, and then we have this timeline, which is what I'd say represents real life, basically. Our fighters, the big consideration for our fighters is they will need or want to fight once a quarter, once they've been in the academy over 6 months. So this will, of course, flex based on fight dates, injuries from fights, etc. But basically after a fight, if they have a fight, they will go home and rest for 1 to 2 weeks. Then when they return to training, we have what's called a return to performance phase, which is something that Gavin Prouty, our head of S&C, has set up really well. And this return to performance phase is just like a general fitness phase, getting them back into the swing of things. Now this will flex, the length of this will flex based on the squad deload weeks. So every 3rd week we might have a deload, and when people come back, their return to performance phase will finish at the end of each deload week when they actually arrive. So for instance, if they return with 2 weeks before the start of the next cycle, they'll have a 2 weeks return to performance phase. If they return with 1 week before the start of the next cycle, it'll be a 1 week return to performance phase. And this is so everything syncs up and all the athletes are on the same loading cycle, and we're not dealing with, say, 12 different loading cycles across 25 athletes, but everyone syncs up as much as possible. Now, we will do diagnostics in this timeline, and I'll show you those here now. And this might also flex based on individual requirements and what things are happening. The FV stands for Force Velocity Diagnostics, the ES stands for Energy System, and the SN stands for Sports Nutrition. So the Force Velocity Diagnostics might be things on dual force plates, like force decks, and we'll use things like a mid-thigh pull, counter movement jump, loaded counter movement jump. Energy System Diagnostics will be like a VO2 max test, some metabolic power tests, like maximal lactic power, mean glycolytic power. Your sports nutrition test will be like your resting metabolic rate and your DEXA scans. So you can kind of see how these are structured. Now, all our force velocity testing will get picked up in strength and conditioning, whereas your energy system testing and also your sports nutrition testing will be collected by the sports science individually, sports science or sports nutritionists individually. So just an example of some system-based force velocity diagnostics. Say if we're looking at a mid-thigh pull, they'll go into 2 streams, basically one above our standard and below our standard. The 2 standards are based on the UFC roster around the world and the data we've collected across both performance institutes, and it's also based on our internal academy roster. And we've come up with what we have your average and then also minus your smallest worthwhile change. And you're either above or below that standard with your testing. And then, so for instance, for the mid-thigh pull, if they're above our maximal force production standard, then we would go into some dynamic strength index or force velocity diagnostics. If they're below that, we would go into a maximum force emphasis. And you'll see here there's another slightly lightly shaded box. This light grey represents where you could go if you're logistically able to or felt the athlete needed that level of intervention. So say you had a person that didn't meet the maximal force emphasis or didn't meet the maximal force requirements that we have, and you had the time logistically, and you also thought it was of importance to them to, then you could investigate something like your eccentric utilization ratio and say, hey, do you need more stretch shortening cycle emphasis if it's below 1.1, or do you need more overcoming inertia emphasis if it's above 1.3 in your strength training? So I'll also make another note on this, is that I will say we are collecting all the necessary information every testing cycle to provide the dynamic strength index or force velocity calculations within the strength and conditioning sessions, but whether that is used to inform what we'll do with the athlete depends on whether or not they meet those certain standards. So it's there if we need it, but if we don't need it, it's still there. Then, as an example of how we might get into a force velocity balance, if they do meet those maximal force standards, they would go into this force velocity profiling where there's either going to be a speed power emphasis or there's going to be a max force emphasis. I've talked about the max force emphasis just in the previous slide, but say for instance you had a speed power emphasis and you might want to say, okay, we've got the ability to go further down the rabbit hole with this individual. We're going to look at RSI and we're going to break down RSI into flight time or contact time. Do they need more work on displacement, i.e. a flight time emphasis, or do they need more work on a contact time and reducing contact time to bring their RSI up to the standard we want? This is a look now at our energy system diagnostics and how we have a system around our energy systems. So again, similar standards. If they're above standard or below standard. In this case, if they're below standard, they'll go into a conditioning emphasis, and we will focus on either VT1 or VT2, your two venturi thresholds, and how those are balanced compared to one another. If there is something there we need to work on, the prescriptions from this for conditioning will mainly be heart rate based around where those venturi thresholds are. However, if they're above the standard in VO2 max, then we would move to a metabolic power approach and would start using power to determine the conditioning program. So this might be watts per minute, total watts within either glycolytic or lactic emphasis or alactic emphasis style program. Now, all these diagnostics are great. Then what happens, you have to take them out and put them into something that makes sense within your current performance process and your schedule and your program. So what happens, these physical diagnostics, they'll decide the priorities based on the lowest Z score, for example. Then you have to get feedback from the technical coach and the non-technical coach, so your MMA and S&C coaches. How do these reflect the athlete's training style? What is their fighting style like? So say, for instance, one athlete come up with a poor VO2 max test, and then your technical coach was like, hey, that doesn't make much sense to me because this guy's really fit on the mat and he seems to do well all the time in technical training. Well, then that just starts the process of diving into it a little bit more deeply. You might ask, is the guy that's doesn't seem to get fatigued on the mat and seems fit on the mat, is it because he's just more technically competent than everyone else and he can control the pace? He's a baller, you know what I mean? He knows exactly how to control the pace and to always stay within the confines of his physical fitness. Or maybe it's the S&C coach will say, well, look, he doesn't run really well and we're testing the VO2 max on running. Maybe it's due to the mode that we're using to test and not necessarily the actual athlete's functional capacity for fitness. So all these things might influence where you go with those physical diagnostics. Then you would go to, say, the physical therapy department and look at any injury risk or injury management considerations. Do they have any asymmetry from your jaw force plates? Is there something the physical therapist has picked up? What's their history like? So, for instance, if you have a very wrestling dominant program, which puts a lot of load on necks and lower backs, if the athlete has a history of that, do we need to consider adding more preparatory work for the neck and lower back than what they might do as part of the regular program? Or is it something that they need their load and sessions modified in the technical sessions? The other big consideration with professional MMA is the weight management consideration. So every athlete will have a mass to weight class ratio and a lean body mass to weight class ratio. And we want to keep them within a reasonable percentage of their weight class in training, and they might need to go up or down based on where things are heading. But this is a big thing in regards to calorie control, either eating more calories or taking calories away, and also if they need to do extra cardio to maintain body mass. So all these considerations, once you've got your physical diagnostics, come into play to actually make decisions on what you're going to do with athletes. And like I said, these decisions, logistically, they've got to fit into your program and the schedule that you're using. So this is an example of the schedule that we use. I'll actually make the first thing I'll say about the setup is it's really designed around when the athlete's going to nap each day, and we actually give them a bit more time, if you see, on the Tuesdays and the Fridays after the real hard sessions for napping, and it's offset by 30 minutes there in the afternoon. There are 4 phases on every day, 4 columns, and these have our phases, which is late fight camp, early fight camp, off camp, specific prep, and off camp general prep. And the setup is designed so the NTT, or the non-technical training, is as complementary as possible to the technical training. And I'll talk about this in a bit more detail later on in this presentation. We also have, you can see the array of disciplines interacting with one another and listed here. So for instance, there will be weight checks for athletes on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, where they'll weigh themselves in the morning and report their weights back to our sports nutrition department. There's fuel bar and nutrition diagnostics. Fuel bars is before and after every training session. Nutrition diagnostics will normally be first thing in the morning. For the physical therapy department, there's triage and also treatment times around training. There'll also be physical therapy support within the training sessions. And we have a thing called Prep the Day and Team Rehab, which is a combination of our physical therapy and strength and conditioning department. These will normally be run, if they are in team rehab, an injured athlete or long-term rehabilitation, these will normally run in the morning during the technical training session, so they won't be involved in the technical training sessions. And this way it's easier that we can manage their load, and it's easier to phase them back into technical training in the PM where there's split sessions and the sessions aren't so long, and also maintain load in technical areas that we need to. And of course you can see the S&C sessions. So in this particular weekly timetable, there's 3 S&C sessions: the Monday afternoon, Tuesday afternoon, and Friday afternoon. And we'll talk more about that setup in a second. Now, what this brings us to, in this setup, there's some constraints based on the program about what we can do with the athletes and what we're going to do with the athletes. So we have this decision matrix. And this is an example of the system for strength conditioning and the decisions that will happen within these constraints of our program. And it basically lets everyone know exactly how and where the S&C department will bucket the squad on each day within each periodization phase. Now, essentially, there's 3 decisions for each phase we have, and we'll get into these in a bit more detail once we explain the complementary pairings for technical training and non-technical training. But this just gives you an idea of, say, in the second session of off-camp, their conditioning. Is it going to be VT1, VT2 work, or is it going to be average power work based on what we want to do? Now, how we make up our week depends upon these complementary technical and non-technical pairings. Now, when you're looking at this, high is a high impact based on what it's going to do to your recovery processes, and our high technical sessions are normally paired with high non-technical sessions on the same day. So, for instance, this will impact the next day. And so, for instance, for max strength or lactic ESD work, the next day after you do those sessions, you're probably not going to be able to, it'll interfere a lot with technical training. So we always put our hard non-technical sessions after sparring, and this means that the next day will be moderate and easy drilling, and this might also be mode specific. So in the low technical sessions, it might be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for instance, where there's potentially not much mechanical energy being exerted. You're sitting down a lot. There's a lot of technical drilling, and it serves as like a low heart rate regeneration session. So there's mode considerations around this as well. And Dean, the technical coach, can definitely get into this in the live Q&A. Then there's, for instance, the moderate technical training and the moderate non-technical training. So power and alactic work, if they're at appropriate volume, won't impact technical training as much. So it'll mean you're fresher for sparring. And then also there may even be some potentiation benefits if you do it the day before or the evening before sparring. And this is just like what you might do in track and field, where you might go in the day before competition. In the afternoon, you might go and do a primer lift or something like that, where you throw some light weights around, throw some medicine balls, jump over some hurdles. That type of thinking is what we've applied to this complementary pairings between technical and non-technical training. So if we go back to the schedule, you'll really see, and you'll probably pick it up more here, how we have moderate load or moderate S&C, the power alactic work, before the hard technical training work on the next day, and the high load or high impact S&C work, which is our max strength lactic acid work, after the hard technical training, and also before the easy technical training. And like I said, the easy technical training also serves as a regeneration session in the middle of the week, similar to what tempo recovery might look like for a track and field athlete. If you're also looking at this, you might also see that this gives us our daily undulation and load across the week, where we go moderate, high, low, and moderate, high, low. So it's just two moderate, high, low cycles put back together on one another. And our days are set up so that high days are really high and low days are really low. Again, it's similar to a track and field setup. I would say this is probably one of the biggest things I see in the setup of weeks when people program and across different sports and structures, is that people may think they're doing moderate, high, low or high, low alternations, but it's basically just ends up being moderate, 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 or high, 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 depending on relativity to the athletes, of course, throughout the week. So to be honest, there's nothing wrong with this, and there are other potential considerations here, like if the high sessions might be separated by a nighttime sleep. And I'd also say there are examples of very successful gyms, MMA gyms, like for instance Eugene Behrman and City Kickboxing in New Zealand, who do this, and then load in the week across the days would be reasonably constant. But for our philosophy, we prefer having this undulation and load across the week, and it makes sense to what we're doing and how we're applying it to the athletes. So moving into this off-camp template, I really want to highlight strength and conditioning here. And you'll see where our strength and conditioning sessions are within the week for off-camp. And these sessions, the technical sessions may change a bit, but this is a basic template. So the first strength and conditioning session on the Monday, it's almost always going to be speed and power or alactic conditioning at a moderate volume. And that's to potentiate sparring on the next day and not to interfere with the technical work of sparring on the next day, which is your most important session. The Tuesday sparring will actually be slightly more important than the Friday sparring, but the power and alactic work helps potentiate that Tuesday sparring, and we want to do as little as possible to interfere with both of those important sparring sessions. Then the second day, we'll have max strength and conditioning, and this might be weakness based on where they fit within those system diagnostics I showed you previously. The third session on the Friday afternoon will be normally a contrast work. So Gavin again will set up a contrast. It might be strength, speed. This might be based on their weaknesses as well. So for instance, if they need more max force production, it might be a heavy moderate contrast. If they need more speed power, it might be a moderate light contrast. And then they'll also do some conditioning based on their weaknesses. Now, one thing, if they don't have any weaknesses, it might just be as simple as in general preparation, these guys are going to do some aerobic conditioning. In specific preparation, these guys are going to do some lactic conditioning. And that's how it revolves if the person might not have any weaknesses. Lastly, if it's needed, there might be some conditioning on the sixth session or the sixth day of the week, the Saturday, where we might do some more conditioning. This might also be for weight management if our sports nutrition department has concerns about their weight. Then I'll show you our fight camp template, which is slightly different, and we take some of the non-technical training away. We reduce the strength conditioning load, and it's also broken up into two parts. So it depends on whether you're an early or late fight camp. So early fight camp, there will be normally 3 sessions, two sessions with the potential for a third. The first session will again be the speed and power. There may not be any alactic conditioning in this session though, because we hope that we've done all the work needed for metabolic power, non-technical metabolic power, in their off-camp. And now all their conditioning comes from technical work. You're getting fit through the sport, if you want to say that. But if it is needed, we have the ability there to put it in on that Monday afternoon. Then the second session, again, will be a contrast set up similar to what I detailed previously. And we'll have a last session where there might be some conditioning again if needed, but like I said, we'd prefer to get it all from the sport, if possible, in fight camp. Then you move into late fight camp, and here really it's only going to be speed and power work and maybe remedial work. And you're only going to do work in S&C in the -3 and -2 weeks, because like I said, that last, or like I alluded to previously, that last week is pretty much weight cutting, and any major significant S&C in that last week is going to be really hard to do and might actually interfere with the actual performance in the fight. So look, that wraps everything up. Hopefully it was a really good overview and insight of our philosophy and program, and I really hope it gives a decent idea of how vision and mission impact the performance process, how we've set up a system-based approach, and also how that applies to our decision making, and just how our program works on both a meso and microcycle basis. For people wanting to know more details on the specifics of the program and how the technical areas interact in detail, for instance, what's the interaction of sports nutrition on technical training and non-technical training, which is so huge in the sport of MMA with the weight cut considerations, or how we program recovery based on what sessions the athletes are doing, I highly recommend jumping on a live Q&A with the rest of the Shanghai PI staff. I think it'll be well worth your timing. And look, thanks for taking the time to listen, and I look forward to catching up with everyone on the live Q&A.